December 26, 1944, 1650 hours. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. General Dwight David Eisenhower sat at his desk, exhausted beyond measure, surrounded by maps covered in red pencil marks showing German advances. On his desk lay a stack of letters, condolence letters, pre-written, addressed to the families of 10,000 American soldiers who were about to die at Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded for 7 days. They had ammunition for maybe 4 more hours of fighting. After that, they'd be throwing rocks at German tanks. Eisenhower had made the hardest decision of his command career a week earlier: send George Patton. The one general everyone said was impossible to work with. The one who'd slapped shell-shocked soldiers and nearly ended his own career. The one whose ego was as big as his tactical brilliance. The one who promised something that every other senior officer said was impossible. And now the phone was ringing. Eisenhower picked it up. Patton's voice came through the line. "We did it. 4th Armored made contact with the Screaming Eagles." Eisenhower closed his eyes. His chief of staff later reported that for the first time in the entire war they saw their supreme commander cry. And what Eisenhower said in that moment, and in the days and years that followed, would forever change how he viewed the most controversial general in American history. December 19, 1944. 7 days earlier. Eisenhower stared at the situation map in disbelief. Hitler had launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, smashing through American lines in the Ardennes forest with 400,000 men. The Germans had punched 50 miles deep into Allied positions, creating a massive bulge that threatened to split the entire Western Front, and at the centre of this disaster was Bastogne, a small Belgian town nobody had heard of that suddenly became the most important place in Europe. 7 roads converged there. Control Bastogne and you control the region. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been rushed into the town with whatever equipment they could grab. Now they were surrounded. 10,000 lightly armed paratroopers facing 3 times their number in German panzer divisions, artillery and infantry. The weather had closed in. No air support, no resupply, no evacuation of wounded. Ammunition was being rationed to 10 rounds per rifle. Artillery shells were nearly gone. Medical supplies exhausted. Surgeons were operating without anesthesia because there wasn't any left. Wounded soldiers were dying from exposure in the freezing cold because there weren't enough buildings to shelter them all. Eisenhower's staff calculated the 101st could hold for maybe 4 to 5 days. A week, if they were lucky. Then they'd be overrun and annihilated. Eisenhower faced a strategic nightmare with no good options. British forces under Montgomery were contained in the north, unable to reach Bastogne quickly. American forces elsewhere were engaged or too far away. There was exactly one commander with the strength, mobility, and operational capability to mount a relief operation: George S. Patton, 100 miles south, currently engaged in heavy combat. And Eisenhower's relationship with Patton was complicated at best. Patton was brilliant. Nobody disputed that. But he was also a walking public relations disaster. The slapping incidents in Sicily had nearly gotten him court-martialed. His political statements were tone-deaf and embarrassing. His ego required constant management. He created problems that distracted from winning the war. Eisenhower had protected Patton's career multiple times when other commanders wanted him relieved. He'd taken political heat for keeping Patton in command. And now, with 10,000 American soldiers about to die, Eisenhower realized with grim certainty that Patton was the only man who could save them. Not because Eisenhower liked him, not because working with him was easy, because when the impossible needed to become possible, Patton delivered. The decision to call Patton was agonizing. Eisenhower later described it as one of the hardest choices of his entire command. But there was no alternative. He picked up the phone and summoned Patton to an emergency meeting at Verdun. December 19th. Verdun. The room was filled with senior Allied commanders, all looking at maps showing the German breakthrough and discussing how to contain the disaster. Eisenhower opened the meeting by reframing the situation. This wasn't a disaster, he said. This was an opportunity. The Germans had overextended. If Allied forces could hit them from multiple directions, they could destroy the entire German offensive and shorten the war. It was leadership psychology. Maintain confidence even when the situation looked hopeless. But privately, Eisenhower was terrified they'd lose the 101st before relief arrived. He asked the assembled commanders, "How quickly can we mount a relief operation to Bastogne?" Most generals hesitated, calculating logistics, weather, enemy strength. They talked about a week, maybe 10 days if everything went perfectly. Then Patton spoke. "I can attack on December 22nd with 3 divisions. The room went silent. December 22nd was 3 days away. Patton was currently engaged in combat 100 miles south of Bastogne. What he was proposing was a 90-degree pivot of his entire Third Army, disengage from current combat, march through the worst winter weather Belgium had seen in decades, and attack German forces from the south. It was operationally insane. Eisenhower looked at Patton carefully. "George, I need the truth, not bravado. Those are American soldiers dying in Bastogne. I need to know what you can actually deliver." Patton met his eyes. "I've already prepared 3 plans, detailed plans. We war-gamed contingencies. I started planning 2 days ago when I saw this developing. I can attack December 22nd with 3 divisions, and I will break through to Bastogne." Eisenhower felt the weight of the decision. Everything he knew about military logistics said Patton's promise was impossible. But everything he knew about Patton said that impossible was what Patton did. This was the man who'd broken through at Normandy when everyone said it couldn't be done, who'd pursued retreating Germans across France at speeds that violated every doctrine about supply lines, who'd consistently delivered results that looked impossible on paper. Eisenhower made the call. "You have operational freedom. Do whatever you need to do. But George, understand this clearly. If you fail, it's not just 10,000 soldiers dead. It's the end of your command career, maybe the end of mine too. The entire Allied command structure will be questioned. This needs to work." Patton nodded. "It will work. I won't fail." As Patton left to begin the operation, Eisenhower turned to his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, and said quietly, "That seems impossible." Smith looked at him. "That's why you're sending Patton. Impossible is what he does." That phrase would haunt Eisenhower for the next week as he watched Patton attempt the most complex military maneuver of the European campaign. Impossible is what he does. It had to be true, because if it wasn't, 10,000 American paratroopers were going to die. December 20th through 25th, the longest 6 days of Eisenhower's command. Patton's Third Army began its pivot northward under conditions that should have made movement impossible. Blizzards, ice storms, roads buried in snow, temperatures well below zero, and constant German resistance. Eisenhower received hourly updates. Each one was tense. Patton was moving, but not as fast as hoped. German defences were stronger than anticipated. Weather was worse than forecast. And inside Bastogne, the 101st was dying. December 21st brought one piece of good news. When German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum to Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defence, sent back a one-word reply: "Nuts." When German officers asked for clarification, American negotiators explained it meant "go to hell." The defiance boosted morale across Allied forces, but it didn't change the arithmetic. The 101st had ammunition for maybe 3 more days. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded soldiers were dying untreated. December 22nd, Patton attacked as promised, but progress was slow. German resistance was fierce. Every mile gained cost casualties and time. Eisenhower sent encouraging messages to the defenders at Bastogne, but privately he was calculating how many days they had left. Maybe 3, maybe 4 if they were lucky. December 23rd brought a brief weather break. Allied aircraft bombed German positions and dropped supplies to Bastogne. Ammunition, medical supplies, food. It bought time, but not salvation. German attacks intensified, the perimeter contracted. Eisenhower urged Patton for maximum effort. The situation was desperate. December 24th, Christmas Eve. Eisenhower couldn't sleep. He stayed at headquarters, monitoring radio traffic, studying maps, and doing something he'd never done before, writing condolence letters in advance, just in case. He wrote to families explaining that their sons, husbands, and brothers had died as heroes, fighting impossible odds, buying time for the Allied advance. He wrote about sacrifice and duty and the cost of freedom, and he prayed he wouldn't have to send them. His staff found him early Christmas morning, still at his desk, surrounded by unsent letters. They'd never seen him look so exhausted, so emotionally drained. The weight of command was visible. Every decision he'd made as Supreme Commander had carried enormous consequences. But this one was personal. He'd sent Patton. He'd believed in Patton's promise. And if Patton failed, 10,000 soldiers would die because Eisenhower had trusted the wrong man. December 25th, Christmas Day, no breakthrough yet. Fighting continued, casualties mounted, and inside Bastogne, the defenders were down to their last reserves of ammunition. Hours, not days. That's what they had left. December 26th, 1650 hours, the phone call. Patton's voice. We did it. 4th Armoured Division made contact with the Screaming Eagles at Bastogne. The corridor is narrow, but it's open. Supplies and reinforcements are moving. Eisenhower's hands were shaking as he held the phone. His Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, watched his commander close his eyes and take a breath that seemed to release a week of tension. When Eisenhower opened his eyes, they were wet. Not embarrassed tears, relief tears, joy tears, tears of a commander who'd sent soldiers into an impossible situation and they'd survived. Patton, never comfortable with emotion, tried to deflect credit. The paratroopers did the hard part. They held until we could reach them. Eisenhower's voice was steady but thick with emotion. George, you did the extraordinary. You promised 72 hours and you delivered. 4 hours to spare, 4 hours before they would have been overrun. The staff calculated it later. If Patton's forces had arrived 4 hours later, Bastogne would have fallen. The defenders were literally on their last magazines of ammunition. 4 hours separated salvation from annihilation. And Patton had delivered with exactly that margin. Not by luck, by driving his forces beyond what anyone thought possible and breaking through at the last possible moment. What Eisenhower said publicly and privately in the days that followed revealed how profoundly the relief of Bastogne had affected his view of Patton. Publicly, in official communications, Eisenhower hailed the operation as one of the outstanding achievements of the war, demonstrating operational art at its highest level. His official telegram to Patton was effusive in praise: speed, aggression, tactical brilliance, operational excellence. But the private communications were more revealing. In his personal diary, Eisenhower wrote, "Patton saved not just 10,000 men today. He saved the entire Ardennes campaign. If we'd lost the 101st, the psychological impact would have been devastating. Morale would have collapsed. The Germans would have sensed weakness and pressed harder. George's operation restored confidence in American military capability. Whatever frustrations he causes, whatever management problems he creates, this moment justified every bit of it." Eisenhower sent a separate, personal message to Patton that night. Not through official channels. A direct communication. "George, I doubted whether anyone could do what you promised. I believed in you because I had no choice. Now I know I was right to believe. What you accomplished will be studied by military historians for generations. Thank you for proving that the impossible is just another objective for the Third Army." To his superiors and peers, Eisenhower was equally effusive. In communications to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, Eisenhower wrote that Patton's relief of Bastogne represented American military capability at its absolute peak. The complexity of the operation, disengaging from combat, pivoting an entire army, advancing through terrible conditions, and breaking through prepared defences, exceeded anything attempted previously in the war. British Field Marshal Montgomery, no fan of Patton's, received a message from Eisenhower emphasizing that the relief operation had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical victory. It demonstrated that Allied forces could respond rapidly to German offensives, could coordinate complex operations under pressure, and possessed the operational flexibility that German forces lacked. Montgomery, to his credit, sent formal congratulations acknowledging the brilliance of the operation. Eisenhower's diary entries during the days after the breakthrough revealed the emotional toll the siege had taken. He wrote about the sleepless nights, the constant fear that he'd made the wrong decision, the weight of knowing that 10,000 lives depended on trusting Patton. And he wrote about the relief, the almost physical sensation of pressure lifting when that phone call came through. One entry is particularly revealing. "I've commanded millions of men, made decisions affecting entire nations. Nothing prepared me for the feeling of waiting while soldiers died and hoping the relief would arrive in time. When George called, I understood something I hadn't before. Command isn't just about strategy and logistics. It's about trusting the right people with impossible tasks and living with the consequences." The historical impact of what Eisenhower said about Patton's achievement extended far beyond immediate congratulations. When Eisenhower wrote his memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, he dedicated significant space to the Battle of Bastogne. The relief operation was described as a pivotal moment, not just tactically, but as an example of American military excellence. Eisenhower's assessment was clear. Patton had accomplished something unprecedented in modern warfare. The speed, the coordination, the aggressive execution under impossible conditions set a new standard for operational art. In a 1964 interview, 20 years after the battle, Eisenhower was asked about his most difficult command decisions. He cited the decision to launch D-Day despite uncertain weather, and he cited entrusting Patton with the relief of Bastogne. "I knew George could do it," Eisenhower said, "but knowing and watching are different. Those 6 days were among the most stressful of the entire war. Every hour that passed without breakthrough meant more Americans dying. When George called on December 26th, I felt something I rarely felt during the war, profound relief." The interviewer pressed, "Was trusting Patton the right decision?" Eisenhower's answer was unequivocal. "Absolutely. George was difficult to work with. He created problems. He said things that embarrassed the command. But when American soldiers needed saving, he was the only man who could do it. And he did it." Eisenhower's final public assessment came in 1965, shortly before his death. In a compilation of his wartime reflections, he wrote about the generals he'd commanded and their legacies. About Patton, he wrote, "History will remember George Patton for many reasons. His aggressive tactics, his controversial statements, his larger-than-life personality. But he should be remembered most for December 26, 1944, when he saved an entire division from annihilation through operational brilliance. That single operation justified every frustration, every political problem, every management headache he ever caused. Because when it mattered most, when 10,000 American soldiers were hours from death, George Patton did the impossible." That phrase again, the impossible. It became the defining characteristic of how Eisenhower viewed Patton's greatest achievement. Other generals were competent, many were excellent, but only Patton could be handed an impossible task and deliver it precisely on schedule. The relief of Bastogne wasn't just about tactics or operational art. It was about a commander who refused to accept that something couldn't be done and willed it into existence through force of personality and relentless execution. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton remained complicated until Patton's death in December 1945, killed in a traffic accident just months after the war ended. They were never close friends. Their personalities were too different. Eisenhower was political, diplomatic, careful. Patton was aggressive, blunt, careless with words. But Bastogne created a bond of respect that transcended personal compatibility. Eisenhower understood that managing Patton was part of his job as Supreme Commander, and that managing difficult genius was worth it when that genius delivered miracles. In private conversations after the war, Eisenhower was more candid about Patton than he ever was publicly. He admitted that Patton drove him crazy, that protecting Patton's career from his own mistakes was exhausting, that there were times Eisenhower wanted to relieve him just to eliminate the management headache. But then he'd remember December 26, 1944. The phone call, the relief. The 10,000 soldiers who went home to their families because Patton refused to accept that their rescue was impossible. And Eisenhower would acknowledge that some people are worth the difficulty because they deliver results nobody else can achieve. George was worth it, Eisenhower told an interviewer in 1963. Every problem, every headache, every political embarrassment, worth it. Because when I needed the impossible, George delivered. The legacy of what Eisenhower said about Patton saving the 101st extends into military education and doctrine. West Point teaches the relief of Bastogne as a case study in operational art and command decision-making. Eisenhower's decision to trust Patton despite doubts is examined as an example of knowing when to override conventional wisdom. Patton's execution is studied as operational excellence under pressure, and the entire operation is presented as proof that aggressive leadership combined with tactical flexibility can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The emotional dimension is part of the lesson too. Eisenhower's visible relief, the tears, the personal investment in the outcome. These aren't seen as weakness, but as the human reality of command. Leaders make decisions affecting thousands of lives. They live with the consequences. They feel the weight. Eisenhower's emotional response to the successful relief wasn't unprofessional. It was human, and it demonstrated that great commanders care deeply about the soldiers they send into danger. Modern military leaders study Eisenhower's management of Patton as an example of how to handle difficult subordinates with exceptional capabilities. The lesson is clear. When you have someone who can do the impossible, you manage the difficulty because the results justify the effort. You don't relieve them because they're hard to work with. You create conditions where they can succeed despite their flaws. The story of Bastogne and what Eisenhower said about Patton's role in saving the 101st Airborne resonates because it captures something fundamental about leadership and warfare. Wars aren't won by perfect plans or ideal conditions. They're won by leaders who refuse to accept defeat and subordinates who deliver the impossible when it's required. Eisenhower could have calculated the odds, declared relief impossible, and accepted the loss of the 101st as an unavoidable casualty of war. Instead, he trusted the most difficult general in his command to accomplish something every other senior officer said couldn't be done. And Patton delivered, precisely on schedule, with 4 hours to spare. That's not luck. That's excellence. Eisenhower's assessment, "Impossible is what he does," became the defining phrase describing Patton's greatest achievement. And Eisenhower's public and private statements praising Patton for the relief of Bastogne established the historical record that Patton, despite all his flaws and controversies, was a military genius who saved thousands of American lives through operational brilliance. The 10,000 soldiers of the 101st Airborne who walked out of Bastogne alive didn't care about Patton's political statements or his difficult personality. They cared that he'd promised to save them and kept that promise. Eisenhower understood this in a way that transcended his personal frustrations with Patton. Whatever problems George created, he delivered results when American lives depended on it. December 26, 1944, at 16:50 hours, when that phone call came through, Eisenhower said something to his chief of staff that didn't make it into official records but was remembered by everyone in the room. "George did it. The crazy son of a bitch actually did it." It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't diplomatic, but it was honest, relief, amazement, joy, and a grudging acknowledgement that Patton had delivered on an impossible promise. In that moment, all the management headaches and political problems and personality conflicts didn't matter. What mattered was that 10,000 American soldiers were going to live because one difficult, controversial, brilliant general had refused to accept that saving them was impossible. And what Eisenhower said in the years that followed, in official reports, personal diaries, memoirs, and interviews, reinforced that single truth. George S. Patton saved the 101st Airborne Division through operational brilliance, aggressive leadership, and refusal to accept defeat. And for that achievement, Eisenhower believed, Patton deserved to be remembered as one of America's greatest battlefield commanders, whatever his flaws, whatever his controversies, because when it mattered most, he delivered. And that's what Eisenhower said when Patton saved the 101st Airborne. He did the impossible. And impossible is what makes legends.